Number 17. Amber Bradley. In June 2016, police in Layton, Utah discovered 29-year-old Amber Bradley passed out in her front yard. After realizing that she was under the influence of drugs, officers went inside her house and found 4 young men passed out next to a stash of beer, weed, Xanax, and drugs. One of them told the police that Bradley gave them alcohol and that they played beer pong, but the group of friends found the weed inside the home. Another guest reportedly said that he went with Bradley to pick up some Xanax pills. Over the next few days, police questioned a young boy who admitted he was having an intimate relationship with Bradley. He claimed that she promised to buy him a dirt bike if he indulged in the inappropriate affair. According to court records, he told officers that he was hesitant to do what she was asking, but he caved to Bradley's pressure and promises of gifts. Bradley was charged with a laundry list of crimes after the investigation, including multiple felony counts of endangerment. In the first of 2 cases she faced, she took a deal and pleaded guilty to 3 counts of attempted endangerment in exchange for having charges reduced from felonies to simple misdemeanors. She ended up changing her not guilty plea in another case and admitted to 2 felonies in exchange for getting some charges dropped. The judge sentenced Bradley to a maximum prison sentence of 5 years. During a parole hearing in 2019, Bradley said she was in a much better mental state than she was at the time of her arrest. After going through a program meant to rehabilitate her problematic behavior, she admitted that she acted with incredibly poor judgment when she committed her crimes and that she was blinded to the behaviors and habits that she now understood were problematic. Bradley also got sober and received counseling. She told her parole board that she truly looked forward to going back to work and that she was even thinking about going back to school to pursue a degree. While it's unclear how she's doing nowadays, her name has remained largely out of the news, suggesting that she's still on the straight and narrow path. Number 16. Cassandra Bogue and Johnny Ryder. When family members suddenly stopped hearing from 63-year-olds Randall and Wendy Bogue back in April 2017, they decided to call the police and request a welfare check. Officers made multiple attempts to visit the couple at their Lawrenceville, Georgia home, but nobody answered the door and there was no evidence of foul play to justify forcing their way inside. In the meantime, the couple's granddaughter Cassandra Bogue and her boyfriend, 19-year-old Johnny Ryder, were arrested for trying to kill Ryder's parents. This finally gave police probable cause to enter Randall and Wendy's home, where officers discovered their decomposing bodies. The victims' throats were slashed and they had been brutally beaten up with a tire iron. Authorities think that Randall and Wendy were dead for about a week or so before their bodies were located. Someone had taped up the windows and taken other measures to hide the odor of the decaying remains. After a brief standoff with law enforcement, a SWAT team took Cassandra Bogue and Johnny Ryder into custody on suspicion of murder. Cassandra eventually confessed to the double homicide during a preliminary court hearing. According to prosecutors, the young couple waited outside the victims' homes until all the lights had been turned off for the night and the victims had gone to bed. After going inside, Ryder started beating Randall Bogue with a tire iron, while Cassandra dragged her grandma into the same room, where she tied up the elderly woman with duct tape and hit her. The teens finished the pair off by stabbing them and slicing their throats. They kept the bodies behind a closed door while they spent the next week partying at the home with friends, smoking weed, and having all kinds of food delivered. It truly seemed like they felt no remorse for their actions whatsoever. Cassandra Bogue and Johnny Ryder pleaded guilty to the murders and were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Number 15. Tyler Hadley. In July 2011, a troubled teenager named Tyler Hadley invited a group of people from his high school to his family's home in Port St. Lucie, Florida, for a house party. People were surprised, since he had recently complained about how strict his parents were starting to get. Tyler claimed his folks were out of town during the get-together. When someone asked about the possibility of his mom and dad coming home in the middle of the party, he reassured his friends that it would never happen. 60 people showed up, and it wasn't long before everyone got drunk and started destroying the house. At multiple points throughout the night, people asked Tyler where his parents were. He gave a few different stories, causing his guests to joke about how he probably killed his mom and dad. At the time, he was high off of ecstasy, so it was probably easy for his guests to blame drugs for the inconsistencies in his stories. Just weeks earlier, Tyler told a friend that he actually did want to kill his parents and throw a party afterwards, but he was known to act strange and say things that were out of line, so the friend didn't take him very seriously. As the party wore on, he told a few people that he did something bad and that he was going to go away for a long time for it. At one point, he even pulled a close friend aside and said that he murdered his mother and father. The friend noticed the family's cars parked in the driveway and realized that Tyler might not be joking. Tyler then led his friend into the master bedroom, which had stayed locked up tight all night, and revealed a horrific scene. There was blood everywhere and his parents' corpses were in the room. According to the friend, Tyler said he hid his parents' cell phones so they couldn't call for help and beat them both to death with the claw end of a hammer. The friend stayed at the party for a few more hours before deciding to contact law enforcement. In the months leading up to the murders, Tyler's partying and bad behavior had gotten out of control to the point where he ended up on house arrest. His mother even had him committed under Florida's Baker Act, which allows parents to mandate their children to involuntary psychiatric care. Due to the graphic nature of his crimes, Tyler Hadley was charged as an adult. He was found guilty of the murders and was sentenced to life without parole for what he did. Number 14, Jesse Holton. After finishing up his shift on a Sunday morning back in September 2016, Mike Holton went back to his home in Eclectic, Alabama, and realized that his son, Jesse Madison Holton, had thrown a huge party the night before. After discovering the house trashed and noticing evidence of possible drug use, Mike handcuffed Jesse and called his ex-wife, April. As Jesse's mother headed over to the property, Mike called 911 and summoned an officer to the scene. It was apparent to the responding cop that the Holtons had been struggling to discipline their son. The family had a long history of problems revolving around Jesse's erratic behavior, according to Elmore County Sheriff Bill Franklin, and Mike Holton believed his son had a drug problem. After speaking with the family and collecting some evidence, the deputy left the home with plans to come back the next morning with an arrest warrant for Jesse. By then, it seemed like the situation inside the Holton home had calmed down a bit, but just 11 minutes after the deputy pulled out of the driveway and went out to another call, Jesse ran over to a neighbor's house and said that his parents were arguing. The neighbor dialed 911 and the officer came back, only to find what could only be described as a horror scene. Mike Holton was lying dead in his bedroom with a gunshot wound to the head, while April clung to life nearby with a similar wound. She was rushed to the hospital, where she gave in to her injuries the next day, despite doctors' best efforts to save her. Sheriff Franklin described Jesse's demeanor in the aftermath of the shooting as emotionless. He also accused the teenager of showing an eerily disturbing lack of concern for his parents, asking only how his mom was doing and not asking at all about his dad's condition. Jesse fiercely denied killing his parents. He claimed his father shot his mother before turning the gun on himself, and that he was still wearing the handcuffs his dad had put on him earlier that day when the crime was committed. Mike had handcuffed Jesse behind his back, which would have made it practically impossible for him to carry out the shooting. But authorities believed that he had somehow managed to slip out of the cuffs or had found a key somewhere, allowing him to commit the double murder. Based on the angles of Mike's wounds, Sheriff Franklin said there was no way he caused the gunshot to his head. Jesse was later charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He continued to maintain his innocence while he spent the next year behind bars at the Elmore County Jail while his case carried on. During that time, Jesse missed both his parents' funerals as well as his senior year of high school. He refused to even consider a plea deal since he did not believe he should admit to a crime he didn't commit. Jesse was released on bond in December 2017, and the case was dropped about 10 months later thanks to a lack of evidence. Prosecutors did not dismiss the charges because they thought Jesse was innocent, but rather because they knew they couldn't prove his guilt. Despite feeling relieved over the outcome of the case, Jesse was worried the sheriff would find a reason to put him back behind bars. So he finished high school and moved out of the area to get a fresh start. Jesse initially planned to become a defense attorney so he could help people who were in similar positions to the one he landed in after his parents' deaths, but based on his social media accounts, it seems as though he joined the military instead. During a Dateline interview, Sheriff Franklin expressed his disappointment in the outcome of the case and said he believed Jesse got away with cold-blooded murder. Do you agree with the sheriff, or do you think Jesse was actually innocent? Let us know in the comments below. Number 13. Halloween Homicide. To celebrate Halloween, Mike Williams used to throw huge costume parties every year at his home in Frenchtown Township, Michigan. The annual bash drew a crowd of hundreds of people, and up until 2014, it was always a good time. Over 600 people showed up to the party on October 25th that year, including 22-year-old Chelsea Ellen Brock, who was thrilled to show off her poison ivy costume. Chelsea went to the party with a few friends and stayed until 3 o'clock in the morning. As the crowd thinned out and the party-goers started to head home, several of Chelsea's friends offered to give her a ride. She declined all of them, and everyone went their separate ways. The next morning, Chelsea's parents realized that she failed to come home from the party. They immediately started searching for her with help from the community, who rallied around the family in an effort to find the missing woman. Chelsea's family initially offered a $17,000 reward for information regarding her whereabouts. When it failed to dig up any useful tips, the family raised the reward amount to $30,000 and pleaded to the public for help finding her. In the meantime, investigators questioned partygoers in hopes of gathering some useful info. A few people mentioned seeing Chelsea leave the event that night with a man, but this failed to bring detectives any closer to a helpful answer. Another man who had been seen with her earlier that day was questioned and ultimately cleared of suspicion. 6 months after Chelsea's disappearance, her poison ivy costume was discovered at an abandoned industrial site. It looked as if it had been violently ripped off of her, giving investigators the first solid piece of evidence that an attack had taken place. A few weeks later, the young woman's remains were found in a shallow grave near some train tracks at a rural construction site. The killer stayed at large, while police continued working round the clock to identify a suspect. In the year after Chelsea's disappearance, investigators carried out 800 interviews, followed up on hundreds of tips, and obtained 34 search warrants. 50 law enforcement agencies helped with the investigation, and civilians stayed equally committed to finding justice for Chelsea and her family. As the one-year anniversary of the young woman's disappearance approached, Mike Williams told the press he would not be hosting his annual Halloween party. He said that he didn't know Chelsea personally, but that he was devastated by her disappearance and death. Williams received a lot of bad publicity early on in the case, and also became a key suspect for a brief period during the investigation. Police eventually ruled him out, but he went through a lot before they crossed him off their list. On top of the fact that it would feel inappropriate to host a party at the site, it's probably safe to assume that Williams wanted to put the past year's events behind him and move on with his life. On July 25, 2016, a year and 9 months after Chelsea went missing, authorities matched DNA evidence found on the poison ivy costume to 27-year-old Daniel Allen Clay. During questioning, he admitted to being involved in Chelsea's death, but claimed it was all an accident. He told police officers that he saw Chelsea walking on the side of the road and picked her up that night, and that they had a consensual sexual encounter. Clay said that Chelsea asked him to choke her during the act, and that he suffocated her to death without meaning to. But the young woman's autopsy told a very different story, and her death was ruled a homicide by blunt force trauma. Throughout his trial, Clay stuck to his story that he accidentally killed Chelsea, and that he disposed of her body instead of calling the police because he was afraid they would accuse him of killing her. Unswayed by the defendant's claims, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was later sentenced to life without parole. Number 12. Adam Jenkins. During the 2021 holiday season, an English businessman named Adam Jenkins hosted his family's Christmas party at his house in the village of New Bottle. The party went well until later in the evening, when Jenkins was woken up from a nap by a loud noise. He went to go check it out and noticed his sister getting beaten up in his living room by her boyfriend, 39-year-old Simon Birch. The men immediately got into a confrontation, but were quickly separated by other partygoers who stuck Jenkins in his kitchen and took Birch outside. While there, Jenkins grabbed 3 kitchen knives and went outside, where he tracked down Birch and slashed him in the throat. A toxicology test later revealed that the victim had over 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his system. Jenkins claimed he didn't mean to hurt Birch and later argued that he had no memory of the attack, but it seemed pretty deliberate to the police, so he was charged with murder. The arrest came as a shock to Jenkins' friends and family, who described him as a nice, peaceful person who was more likely to try resolving a conflict than to go looking for one. Simon Birch had been dating Jenkins' sister for about 2.5 years, and the couple had a history of domestic violence in that short time. Jenkins said he thought Birch had killed his sister when he saw her lying unconscious and bleeding on the floor. At that point, he either blacked out with anger or went into autopilot mode, causing him to go after Birch. Prosecutors accused Jenkins of being a violent person, but the judge overseeing the case acknowledged that he seemed like an agreeable man. As a result, he was convicted of a lesser manslaughter charge and sentenced to just 8 years in prison. Number 11. Deadly domestic dispute. Married couple Ashley Henning and Jordan Michael Henning were both active duty members of the U.S. military. They were stationed at Fort Knox in Kentucky. In June 2023, while celebrating Ashley's 37th birthday at their home in Rineyville, they got into a heated fight in front of both their children and guests. Neighbors who were at the party later told police that the couple were drinking when the argument broke out and that they tried to calm the two down. After failing to de-escalate the situation, they grew concerned for the safety of the couple's children and removed them from the home. Shortly after leaving, they heard gunshots and noticed Jordan Henning leaving the scene in his car just moments later. The neighbors then went into the home and found Ashley dead on the ground from multiple gunshot wounds to the torso. Police quickly caught up with Jordan and took him into custody. According to law enforcement, he quickly apologized for hurting his wife during the arrest. He now faces 1 count of murder, domestic violence, and could face anywhere from 20 years to life in prison if convicted. Number 10. Graciela Gomez. It doesn't take much for a house party to get out of control, especially with how fast word spreads on social media these days. This was certainly the case for a Halloween party in 2021 at a home in Las Vegas, where droves of people showed up after reading about the event online. As the house became increasingly packed, the host started patting people down as a safety precaution before letting them inside his house. When a group of men showed up after midnight and refused to get patted down, the host turned them away at the door. Angry that they were refused entry, the group got into a car and shot at the house with guns as they drove away. A bullet hit 22-year-old Graciela Gomez, a Nevada National Guard soldier who had no involvement whatsoever in the sour confrontation. She died from her injuries while 2 other bystanders were shot and injured. Poor quality surveillance footage made it impossible to identify any suspects or key people who might provide useful information. According to authorities, multiple partygoers fled the scene before police got there, further hampering the investigation and forcing law enforcement to issue a statement urging people to come forward with what they knew. Even the smallest piece of the puzzle could potentially help detectives get to the bottom of the case, but they never got what they were hoping for. The investigation hit a standstill, and Graciela's murder remains unsolved to this day. Number 9. Joey Harris. In 2020, Cynthia Mose and her family decided to celebrate her 56th birthday. They held a 1-year memorial for her brother's death at the same time. Cynthia attended the event at a home in East Palo Alto with her on-and-off boyfriend of 2 years, 55-year-old Joey Harris. The couple were in the process of breaking up at the time, and Harris allegedly grew jealous of Mose at the party. They got into an argument, and Harris stepped away briefly to go to his car. According to witnesses, he came back with a handgun and loudly commanded Mose to go with him. Shortly after leaving the building, Mose was fatally shot in the chest and back. Harris fled the scene in his car and went to his home in Stockton. He turned himself into the police just 1 day later, along with the gun that was used to kill Cynthia. The accused killer pleaded not guilty to murder and spent the next 3 years behind bars at the San Mateo County Jail on a $10 million bail. A jury officially convicted Harris of first-degree murder in March 2023. According to his records, he is currently awaiting sentencing for the crime. Number 8. Abby Flynn. 59-year-old Abby Flynn's friends were confused when they got to her house in Gloucester, Massachusetts for a Super Bowl party back in 2020, and she wasn't there. Her phone was still on her kitchen counter, and there was even food in the oven, but Abby was not in the building. Her keys, wallet, and dog were also left at the home. It was unlike Abby to pull a vanishing act like this, especially when she was expecting company or to leave the house without any of her belongings. Worried that something bad could have happened to the retired nurse and mother of 3, her friends called the police and the search was quickly launched. The last person to speak with Abby before she went missing was her son, who spoke with her on the phone around 4 p.m. that day. During the conversation, Abby said that she planned to take a walk before the party started. She was last seen outside in the neighborhood about 30 minutes later. At the time of Abby's disappearance, her husband Rich was in a different city, Houston, where he worked as a radiologist. He immediately flew back to Massachusetts after learning that his wife went missing, and police later ruled him out as a suspect. Abby's brother Brian told NBC News that his sister and her husband had a nice life and enjoyed a happy marriage. There was no reason for Abby to walk away from her picture-perfect life, and her loved ones were confident she would never do that. Law enforcement searched the area extensively, but found no trace of the missing woman. Abby's fate remains a mystery to this day, and the investigation is at a standstill. Police are hoping someone will eventually come forward with information that will help bring them closer to answers. Number 7. Theodoro Macias. In April 2021, 2 families got together for a birthday party at a mobile home in Colorado Springs. Shortly after midnight, an armed intruder barged into the property and opened fire on the armed group. Later identified as 28-year-old Theodoro Macias, he shot the victims one after the other, making it clear he was there for the express purpose of carrying out a massacre. 3 people called 911, including a partygoer who managed to escape the bullets and a neighbor who reported rapid gunfire. 7 people lost their lives, including the person whose birthday it was, the shooter's girlfriend, Sandra Ibarra-Perez, and Macias himself. 3 people who left the party with plans to come back a little while later survived miraculously thanks to their timing. Macias and Ibarra-Perez had been dating for a little over a year leading up to the shooting. Those who knew the pair described their relationship as incredibly toxic. According to police, Macias had intense control and jealousy issues. He kept Ibarra-Perez on a short leash and was outraged when he wasn't invited to the party and she went without him. While Macias had no prior criminal record, he had a clear history of possessive behavior, which included his attempts to isolate his girlfriend from her family members. When Ibarra-Perez finally went against his orders, she and 5 other innocent people paid for it with their lives. Number 6. Carroll. In 2017, during her sophomore year at the University of North Texas, Carroll grew increasingly frustrated with her upstairs neighbor's constant partying at all hours of the night. And it wasn't just the noise that irritated her. When these disruptive gatherings were going on, she noticed that her ceiling seemed to bounce up and down from the weight of the partygoers dancing, as if it were on the verge of collapsing. Carly complained to the police multiple times, but nothing was ever done to stop the partying. In fact, the problem got even worse. After a major football win one night, the neighbor threw their biggest event yet. About 100 people crammed into the tiny third-floor apartment. People were too busy dancing and having fun to notice that the weakened floor had become dangerously unstable. Things got even crazier when a popular local DJ showed up and started spinning music at full blast volume. At that point, Carly and her roommates were seriously concerned for their safety. Determined to finally put the problem behind them, they went to the police station to file yet another complaint. In the meantime, just as the girls predicted, the floor opened up and swallowed at least a half-dozen partygoers, who plunged directly into Carly's apartment below, along with furniture, half-full liquor bottles, and the structural supports that had given way under their massive weight. Chaos broke out as people scrambled to avoid falling into the hole, leaving some guests trapped on narrow stretches of floor as they clung to the wall for dear life. Carly and her friends were still at the police station when they heard that their home had been completely destroyed. They were lucky to be safe, but lost almost all their personal belongings and were now among the building's 50 or so residents who were homeless thanks to the damage. It would be unrealistic for someone to live in a building full of college students and expect no late-night noise, but this wasn't exactly the case with Carly and her roommates. The problem was constant, and they knew they were going to be in danger if it continued. Number 5. Charles Robert Smith. In 2023, a high school graduation party turned into a nightmare outside an Annapolis, Maryland home after an argument over a parking space quickly led to bloodshed. The party's host, 27-year-old Mario Antonio Mireles Ruiz, his father, 55-year-old Nicholas Mireles, and 25-year-old Christian Marlon Segovia were killed from bullet wounds by the time police got to the scene. 3 other partygoers were struck by gunfire and lived. According to court documents, a partygoer's car was blocking the driveway where 43-year-old Charles Robert Smith lived with his mother. Smith's mom complained to the police, and Mario Mireles went to the house to try straightening the situation out. A confrontation later broke out between Mireles and Smith, and the men started wrestling over a gun. Mireles was shot during the fierce struggle. Authorities accused Smith of standing over Mireles and firing off several bullets into his body, as well as shooting Christian Segovia, who was standing close by. Smith ran into his house as neighbors and partygoers rushed to the scene to help victims. He opened fire from inside, killing Mario's dad Nicholas as he tended to his bleeding son. Police arrested Smith at the property and booked him into custody on 3 counts of second-degree murder. Smith is also currently facing 3 counts of attempted second-degree murder, 3 counts of first-degree assault, and 1 count of using a firearm during the commission of a violent crime. Records suggest that the shootings were not caused by a one-off disagreement, but instead a long-standing dispute between neighbors dating back years. In 2016, Smith's mom filed for a peace order against Mario Mireles, accusing him of threatening her and hitting her car with a wet towel. She also claimed that she'd seen him throwing rocks at street signs and other vehicles. Mireles accused the elderly woman of being racist and speeding toward him with her car when he was minding his own business, standing outside. In a police complaint, he wrote that it was the first time he had ever thought that his life was in imminent danger. In the days after the mass shooting, reporters from the Baltimore Banner spoke to people who knew Smith to try and learn more about what kind of person he truly was. They interviewed 21-year-old John Maynard, who said that he became friends with Smith after meeting in a reptile enthusiast group they took part in online. Maynard later sold 5 snakes to Smith, and they bonded over their shared hobby. They became fishing buddies, caught snakes, and often explored nature together at a nearby state park. When he learned about Smith's arrest, Maynard said he was completely shocked, but that Smith had previously opened up to him about being a military veteran with PTSD. He remembered several instances where Smith was triggered by sudden loud noises and music, triggering emotional meltdowns and causing him to physically throw items. In one instance, the men got stuck in a traffic jam, and the constant sound of car horns caused Smith to repeatedly punch the steering wheel while lashing out. Maynard said he helped his troubled older friend calm down through deep breathing exercises and took over the driving that day. But it seems nobody was around to talk Smith down on the day of the graduation party massacre, and his apparent lack of self-control cost 3 people their lives. Number 4. Arpana Janaga. After moving to the United States from India, Arpana Janaga earned her college degree at Rutgers University in New Jersey after years of hard work. She graduated in 2008 and landed a comfy software engineering job in Seattle, where she settled into her new life and made many friends. Later that year, the 24-year-old and her neighbors threw a Halloween party at their apartment building, where they often hung out in the hallways and visited each other's homes. Photos from the get-together showed the young woman looking like she was having a good time as she walked around in a Little Red Riding Hood costume with a glass of wine in her hand. By the time Arpana failed to show up at work 2 days later, her parents had already tried to call her multiple times from India. A family friend who lived in the area went to check on her and saw that the lock on the front door to her apartment was broken and the door jamb was damaged. They went into the unit and discovered Arpana lying dead on the floor at the foot of her bed, naked and covered up with a sheet. She was covered in blunt force injuries and had even been gagged with duct tape. The killer went to great lengths to destroy any evidence. The apartment was wiped clean with bleach, and there were burn marks on the carpet where they had apparently tried to light the place on fire. Arpana's fingernails were scrubbed clean and covered in toilet bowl cleaner, and her lower body was doused in motor oil. Neighbors told police officers that they had heard muffled moaning sounds from Arpana's apartment not long after she was last seen standing in her doorway. They assumed it was simply a consensual encounter. For over an hour later, they heard running water and figured that the young woman was taking a really long shower. Investigators later identified 2 male DNA profiles on the duct tape that was used to gag Arpana and a motor oil bottle that was carelessly left behind at the scene. The DNA belonged to a neighbor and a friend of a tenant who were both at the apartment during the party. DNA from other partygoers was found elsewhere at the scene, but because people were in and out of each other's apartments during the night, it wasn't very useful in narrowing down a suspect. 2 years after Arpana's murder, authorities confidently charged Emmanuel Fair in connection to the crime. He had been questioned shortly after the murder and admitted to being one of the 50 or so people who stopped at Arpana's apartment during the party. Investigators claimed that they found traces of Fair's DNA on several key pieces of evidence, including the duct tape, a bloody robe that was in a dumpster outside the building, and Arpana's neck where she was strangled. Authorities also identified some inconsistencies in Fair's story. Cell phone data showed that he had interacted with a few different women over a 3-hour period, during which he originally claimed he was asleep. There were also calls to the woman whose apartment Fair said he was staying at, leading police to suspect that he was lying about his whereabouts. Fair maintained his innocence while he spent the next 9 years awaiting trial in a jail cell. His attorneys accused law enforcement of targeting him because he was the only African-American man at the party and because he had a prior criminal history. They identified several other possible suspects, including a fellow member of the motorcycle club Arpana had recently joined, who had allegedly been harassing her, and a man she was seeing at the time. The defense also claimed the evidence had been mishandled by investigators and argued that the DNA technology to identify the suspect was actually faulty. The company that performed the testing fought tooth and nail to avoid revealing their methods in court, out of a fear that it would put their trade secrets at risk. It was one of the major reasons the case dragged on for so long, while Fair wasted away behind bars, unable to afford bail. Fair's first trial ended in a hung jury. During the second, the jury also became deadlocked, but they continued to deliberate and eventually came to a consensus. After spending almost a decade of his life behind bars for a crime he insisted he didn't commit, Emmanuel Fair was found not guilty and was finally released. Arpana's murder remains unsolved to this day. Number 3. Adam Zapakowski. When 52-year-old James Zapakowski and his wife Allison mysteriously went radio silent in 2005, worried relatives from out of town requested a welfare check at the couple's home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Police tracked down their teenage son, Adam, at a nearby Marriott hotel. He said that his parents were out of town in Texas, but law enforcement was still suspicious and obtained a search warrant for the family's home. When police went into the property, they were immediately hit by a foul stench coming from behind a door that was barricaded by several chairs. Behind it, they found James and Allison's bodies wrapped up in blankets. They had been there for several weeks after getting shot multiple times at close range. Nearby, there was a blood-spattered report card from an expensive private school. It belonged to Adam, who had many issues with his parents thanks to his poor grades. Investigators discovered the murder weapon and some camping gear inside a car in the garage, making it seem as if Adam was planning to flee. Neighbors told police officers that they had recently noticed a terrible smell coming from the home. When they asked Adam about it, he blamed it on spoiled food in the fridge. It was later revealed that Adam had attended his junior prom with his girlfriend. On the weekend, his parents were murdered, and he even threw a party at the home afterward. He spent most of the next 2 weeks at a Marriott hotel, before being arrested for the crime. Prosecutors claimed that James and Allison Zapakowski had banned their son from going to prom because of his failing grades, and that Adam shot his mother and father so he could still attend the dance. They depicted the defendant as a privileged and spoiled young man who believed he was above the rules and killed his parents so he could live how he wanted without their disapproval. Adam's defense attorney said that James Zapakowski had provoked the shootings by mentally and physically abusing his child. Shortly before the double murder, he had allegedly threatened to hit Adam with a baseball bat. Court records showed that one of Adam's friends referred to James Zapakowski as Psycho Dad because he was always screaming at Adam. The teen's sister, Lauren, denied Adam's many claims of abuse. She said their parents loved them unconditionally and did everything they possibly could to give their children good lives. The young defendant spent over a year in a psychiatric facility as the court grappled over his mental condition. Adam claimed he started hearing voices a few years earlier and that his mental state deteriorated under constant pressure from his parents, who accused him of not working hard enough to do well in school. His lawyers considered entering an insanity plea or arguing for a diminished responsibility ruling, but ended up settling on a simple plea agreement. Adam pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He received consecutive sentences of 19 to 24.5 years in prison for his father's murder and 25 years for killing his mother. According to state prison records, he's expected to get released in 2045. Number 2. Matthew Harvey. Unfortunately, shootings at parties are very common in the United States, and graduation parties are no exception to this trend. When gunfire broke out at a home inside an upscale gated community in Indio, California during 2023, it served as a sobering reminder that violence happens across all social classes and no one is immune to it. Police responded to the scene around midnight after getting calls about multiple shots fired. They arrived and found 18-year-old Matthew Harvey dead from 2 gunshot wounds. 3 other victims had also been hit and were taken to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. Police spokesperson Benjamin Guitron told NBC Palm Springs that the community where the shooting happened is usually pretty quiet. He described it as a nice area, but pointed out that it's almost impossible to predict these types of situations. Guitron said there were a lot of people at the party and that investigators were still working to identify a suspect. Authorities have released few details about the case and have declined to speculate on what led up to the shooting. No arrests have been made yet, and police have appealed to the public for information in hopes of getting to the bottom of this unsettling case. Number 1. Joseph McCrimmon. After celebrating her birthday with her mother and sisters at their Brooklyn apartment in 2021, a young girl was woken up by arguing and gunshots from outside her bedroom late one night. She hid in her closet until the noise died down and came out to find her mom, 45-year-old Rashida Bazi, dead thanks to bullet wounds. Her sisters, Salai and Chloe Spears, had also been fatally shot. When investigating the scene, police located the body of 46-year-old Joseph McCrimmon, Rashida Bazi's ex and the father of her surviving daughter. McCrimmon's relationship with Bazi had a rocky history dating back 20 years, but his motive for committing the horrific crime was unclear. Police confirmed that they did not get any 911 calls or complaints about the couple leading up to the shooting, but they knew Bazi and McCrimmon had a difficult past and that McCrimmon was in an agitated state when he drove to Bazi's home the night of the crime. A downstairs neighbor told the New York Times that she overheard arguing at the apartment many times, but that she didn't hear any yelling before the gunshots rang out. After the first 2 shots, the neighbor heard someone screaming out in pain. 3 more shots rang out and were followed by deafening silence. McCrimmon had a lengthy criminal record dating at least as far back as 1995 when he was convicted of manslaughter in the shooting death of a sanitation worker. He served 5 years in prison for this and was paroled in 2000. 13 years later, McCrimmon pleaded guilty to bank robbery and was sentenced to 5 years. He served only 4 after persuading an appeals court to reduce his time, despite federal prosecutors making a note in his file that he was an unlikely candidate for rehabilitation. Given the missed opportunities to keep McCrimmon locked up and the unusual amount of forgiveness afforded to him by the justice system, it's hard not to wonder if this heartbreaking tragedy could have been prevented. Attorney Andrew Rubin, who represented McCrimmon in the bank robbery case, told the Rockland Westchester Journal-News that Rashida Bazi was one of his client's biggest supporters throughout the case. He described McCrimmon as having a limited capacity and said that Bazi helped him out tremendously. Knowing that the victim had compassion for her lover only makes the crime seem even more devastating. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be stuck cleaning up the morning after a college house party or have $50 stolen out of your wallet during a gathering at a friend's house? Let us know in the comments below.